All right, let's get started here today. So, uh, before we get started, any questions about either of the labs that you have due on Sunday? So do recall we have the regular expression lab, we have the SSH lab. So if you do have any questions either now or at the end of class is definitely the time to ask. Okay, so on Wednesday we talked about System D primarily. I just wanted to talk a little bit more, a couple of the things that I didn't get to cover on Wednesday. About System D, going to talk briefly about environment variables, and then hopefully get onto the database stuff that I wanted to hit on Wednesday. So we talked about how to write a service, those kind of things, but the thing to remember is by default, if you don't specify a user or group for your service will run as root. If it's running as root, you can basically do whatever you want. If your service, quote unquote, gets hacked, you're going to be in for a bad time. And most services that you run on these Linux boxes don't actually really require root, so you can get away with or setting a user. So you can also kind of restrict what a root process is allowed to do using capabilities. Just going to talk very briefly about that. Capabilities get kind of advanced, so we'll come back to that later. So let me just get over to my VM here. So just for review's sake, we go over to etc systemd system. We have this simple service, which just executes this simple service.sh script that is sitting out in root. So remember this, simple service.sh, and it will just continuously bind to port 2000 and pipe the output of the ID command into netcat. So before I do anything else here, I want to expand on this a little bit. What I'm going to do is actually capture the output of two commands. I think I can do this. So I'll say ID, and I'll also say pwd, because we're going to talk about that too in a little bit. Let me just run this really quick to make sure I can actually do this. I might have to split that up into two different commands. Yeah, that looks good. So it prints our ID and where we're currently at. So I'll just echo that through. So if we do netstat ltpn, remember that's listen TCP, who owns the process, and do not resolve DNS names. We can see that we got netcat listening on port 2000. If we say ps auxf, or let's do pgrep nc, never mind, let's do that. And grep for netcat. We can see netcat is currently running as root. So let's say somebody had found some sort of exploit inside of netcat and could like read files or get code execution or get a shell or something like that. They'd instantly have root permissions. In this case, netcat isn't really doing anything that requires root permissions. So let's go ahead and change the user that this service is running as. So it's pretty simple, straightforward. You just say right here, let's see exactly where it is. I believe it goes in this section right here. You just say user equals, and then the username that you want it to run as. So a common user that services will run as is nobody. Basically a user that doesn't have any permissions, doesn't own any files, can't really do anything. Nobody. We have to reload. So daemon reload to reparse all of our service files. And then we'll just say systemctl restart simple service. Let's run status to make sure it actually started up correctly. Looks like it's working there. Let's see, listening on 2000. And now when we look at that service, it's actually owned by nobody. So when we netcat to localhost, remember we're running the ID command, we're running pwd, we're capturing that output. So we netcat to localhost 2000. I didn't put a $sign on my script there. Simple service. I need to actually, that's just echoing literal output. I want to echo what's stored in the variable output. I think I'll have to run it one time here to clear out what's already there. Oh no, the script is still running every single time. So I'll restart that service, and then I'll netcat. And now we can see it's running as nobody, and it's working, its directory is slash. So pretty straightforward, just changing the user on that. But let's look at this one right here too, this slash. So we can actually change where it's actually going to start as well. Pretty straightforward. Dsystem simple service. We can say working directory equals. Let's just put it in temp for right now. It's kind of just an easy example. It exists. Reload, restart. Netcat localhost, and now we can see that it had started in temp. So if you're running a script or something, running a command, you probably want to set that's actually doing something with files. You probably want to set where it is, or where it should be running in. So the final thing with systemd that I wanted to talk about was capabilities. So you can either go one of two ways with capabilities. You can disallow capabilities for root, or you can give additional capabilities to a user. And there's two directives that we can look at when we're looking at capabilities. Ambient. So we have capability bounding set, and we have ambient capabilities. So we use capabilities bounding set if we were dealing with a process that needed to be run as root, but we wanted to revoke certain permissions that were granted to root. And we would use ambient capabilities to add permissions to something that wasn't allowed to run as root. So one typical thing that you might do with capabilities is allow a user process to bind to a privileged port. So ports, I believe it's 1 to 1024, do require root traditionally to be bound to. But we can actually allow a capability for a process to do that. So let's look at this really quick here. I'll come back to this in a little bit here. But let's look at our problem. So we have simple service. Let's say we wanted to bind that to a privileged port. Let's say 900 or something like that. I'll go back to a standard user, and I'll try and run that. And it will say permission denied, because that was a privileged port, and it could not, in fact, do that. Let's change back to root. So what we could do is give our service a particular capability. So cd, we could say ambient capability abilities, I think it's ease, yep, just like that. And then we could specify one of these capabilities that root would traditionally have to give to it, give to our service. So if you say man capabilities, I spelt it wrong, capabilities, we can actually have a list, capabilities list, of all of the different capabilities that we can give a process on Linux. So a lot of these aren't particularly interesting, but the one that we are interested in is somewhere around here. CapeNet bind service. So bind the socket to internet domain privileged ports, so ports less than 1024. So what we can do is just take that, copy it, go back over to our service, and say ambient capabilities equals this particular capability. And we can provision multiple capabilities if we want to. I'm pretty sure it's separated by commas or something like that. But now, again, remember we changed our service to bind on, I think it was 900, if I remember correctly. So let's reload. Let's restart. Stat LTPN. We see it's running on 900 there. You can see it's running as nobody. So that's a very, very common thing you'll have to, or a common problem you'll probably run into, is having to run a service on a privileged port, but actually not as root. Now there's a number of different ways that this has traditionally been done. So traditionally, what would happen is something called a privileges drop. So you would start as root, and as the root user, you can actually switch to any other user. One of the things you probably noticed by this point is I can sue to any user without a password, without doing anything like that. So the traditional approach to doing all of this would be the main process would be spawned as root, and it would do all of the things that it was required to do as root, binding to a port, perhaps opening privileged files, things like that. And then once it was actually processing a user request, it would actually switch to a non-privileged user that had no privileges and essentially drop its original root privileges. So we can talk about, it's kind of in the set user ID space, all of those things. But essentially, you can drop privileges and regain them, or you can drop them and permanently drop them so you never actually retain them. And that was kind of the way that things worked before all of this. But if you can run it as a non-privileged user to start out with, that's definitely the way that you want to go with things. Services like SSH, where you're logging in as a particular user, will pretty much always have to have root capabilities because it's required to log in as a particular user to check passwords and things like that. So finally, let's talk about this a little bit more. If you wanted to run something as root and remove all of these capabilities, so we're not doing that right now, we're adding capabilities to a non-root service. What we would say was, we have it right over here, capabilities bounding set. If we just set this, it would remove all of the capabilities. If we wanted to grant all of the capabilities, we would say tilde, and if we wanted to grant individual capabilities, we would again go over here to our capabilities list. We'd find the names that we wanted, and we would put them in here, comma, 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 separated, and so on and so forth. So definitely something to look into more if you're interested in running services securely on Linux and Unix environments. So that's all I had to talk about for Systemd. Now we'll probably have a lab looking at some of that stuff coming up here soon. I'll post it hopefully in the next couple days here. So let's talk about environment variables. So one of the things that you might notice every so often is you have something like var equals something like this. And then you have variable equals, variable equals, variable equals, and then you start a program, and those variables actually do things for that program. So that's something called environment variables. So this would be a typical variable. An environment variable would look something like this, export var equals ASDF. So the difference between these two lines right here, this one and this one, is when we say export var equals some data, what's going to happen is that variable is going to be visible to all child programs. So if we say export var equals ASDF and we run another bash, we should just be able to see var right here. No, it's environment. I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Oh no, yeah, it is. So we executed another bash, which was a child of the other bash, and we still have all of the variables that were available in the parent bash. So if we do ps af, we can see we set our variable here, we're currently here, and that variable is still accessible. If I was to do something like a equals ASDF and then execute bash and echo a, we would see a hadn't been set and there was no content in it. So if we want to set a variable and have it visible to any child programs that respond throughout the rest of our, I guess, cycle of doing things, we need to use the export command to set it as a kind of global variable. So we have this command env right here, which will actually print our environment, kind of all of our global variables. By kind of default, we have a lot of things like shell, which is just an environment variable which says which shell we're running, what user we're running, an SSH variable that was set by SSH actually, which said we're coming from this IP, this is our source port, this is our destination port, our directory, just a bunch of different things that are kind of interesting. But yeah, and so let's look at where those actually come from. So if we look at our bash RC, that's one of the things that's kind of that's executed when we're logging in. It controls a bunch of different things. We'll probably get into talking more about bash RC later on. But this is where a lot of those environment variables are actually set. Also, .profile contains some environment variables, and there's also this file etc environment, which doesn't have anything except for path right now, but etc environment is kind of the global environment. It will set this environment for all processes that are running. So we can see here we have this path. So this is kind of an example. Well, hopefully you all remember path. I'm pretty sure that was something that was talked about in operating environments quite a bit. But path is where bash is actually going to look for the executables that it's going to run. So when I say which, just remember which looks up a command and tells me where it is. Let's say which bash. It will look in all of these locations. So let's see here, where's bin at? Actually, you can see bin is right here. So what bash will do is it will start at this very first directory. It will look inside that directory, see if the binary exists there. It will move on and go down the list. So one thing worth noting is if you have your own versions of bash, if you have your own versions of other programs that you compiled, that you wanted to overwrite other programs in your environment, what you could do is just put their path at the very beginning of this list. Since the path is searched from beginning to end, if you find the program in somewhere in the beginning of the path, or in the beginning of this list of places, it will just assume that that's the one that you wanted and use it. So that's a very, very prominent environment variable that's worth noting. And we can manipulate that pretty easily. Remember, we have to say export if we want it to continue being used. If we only want the path to be changed for this particular shell, what we could say is path equals, let's just say we're going to complete, let's save the old one first. Old equals path, and then we'll say path equals user bin. So we're going to delete everything else, and we're just going to set it to user bin. Now, if I say which bash, it won't actually find it because bash was in in bin, not user bin. And if I try and run it, it won't know where to find it because it will say on Ubuntu. Actually, it's intelligent to know that it's not in our path, but it is available here if it was in our path. So remember, it's pretty easy to execute a program that's not in your path. You could just say the absolute path. You could path. You could say bin bash, and that would typically work. Since we've manipulated our path, things are breaking here a little bit. So yeah. So to revert all of that, remember we did save it before. We saved our path to old, so we could just say path. No, shoot, we need to say A. And when we say which bash again, and now I've completely broken everything. So if you get to that point, you can just log out, log back in, and everything should be back to the way it was before, which bash. And there we go, completely fixed. So just if anyone ever says you need to set an environment variable, just remember that that basically means echo whatever they say for a key. So let's say conf dir or something like that, and just say etc service whatever it is, and that's kind of how you would do it. Or you'd say probably export. Probably say export. All right, so that was environment variables. So I wanted to get into talking a little bit about databases. So just to give you a little bit of insight where I'm kind of going with this, one of the things you'll have to do as a system administrator is set up arbitrary services that require databases. The one that we're going to eventually look at probably is WordPress, so it's just a blogging platform in PHP. But what that will require is a couple of things that we need to know. We need to understand a little bit about databases, how we create them, how we set them up, how we provision users, tables, things like that. It'll require us to know a little bit about web servers. So we're going to look at Apache and Nginx, our two popular web servers that are typically used for that configuration. And then we are going to look a little bit at PHP, just so you can have some basic understanding of the language. Because that is the software, or the software that WordPress is written in. So, like I said in the intro here, we're going to look at two databases right now. So we're going to look at MySQL, and we're going to look at Postgres. So kind of just SQL engines. I could get into the sort of the details between them both, but it's not particularly relevant. Most projects that you'll see will allow support for both of them. They'll just ask you to install either MySQL or Postgres. So let's just go through what it would take to install them, to provision a basic database, a basic table, basic user that had permissions to everything like that. So for both of these packages, there's actually two packages that we can use. There's MySQL-server, there's Postgres-server. So that would just install the server components, but there's also client components. So from the command line, we can use the MySQL command line client to connect to the database and run queries, and there's also a Postgres client that we can use to connect and run queries as well. But those are in separate packages and are not installed by default. So to do this, we just say apt-get install MySQL server, and there's a few megabytes of stuff that we'll download. So MySQL actually prompts you for a root password. I'll set it to password 1 for now. So it actually turns out that MySQL does install the client by default. I know Postgres doesn't, but just looking through that, it does do that. So to log in, you just say MySQL. If you wanted to specify a user, I think you would say capital U, might be lowercase, I think it's capital. So you'd say U root, and you say capital P, and you could, I believe if you say lowercase p, we'll see what happens here. I think capital P means it will actually prompt us for our password. Yeah, so okay. So if we use lowercase u and lowercase p, never mind, we'll use capital U root. If we use capital P, it wants a password right here, like on the command line. If we use lowercase p, it will actually prompt us for the password. Okay, use a database, never mind. So one of the things that's very recommended that you do is don't use the capital P. If I do end up using the capital P, let's go back and see what happens there. And I say password 1 exclamation point. Never mind, it's not capital P. Basically, there exists an option that you can specify on the command line where you can provide the password right there on the command line without prompting for it. But the one thing to remember with that is it will end up in your bash history, so your password will just kind of be laying around. If somebody does hack your box, somebody gains unauthorized access to it, they'll have your password sitting just in the bash history. So we usually want to use the -p. So by default, it did log us in as root. So let's go ahead. A couple things worth noting are we can say show databases. That will show us all of the databases we have. So database is just a collection of tables. We could say use, let's say MySQL, and that would switch us into that database. And then we could say show tables, and that would show us all the tables in that database. So pretty straightforward. So it's not working right. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a user. We're going to let's do this first. Let's create a database. So in Postgres, there's actually, well, we're going to talk about Postgres in a minute, I guess. So I'll come back to that. So you just say create database, database name. So this is kind of what you would have to do in order to set WordPress up. They ask you to create a database. They ask you to create a user. So you just say create database WordPress. Now if I show databases, we have a new database, WordPress. So then I would also want to create a user. So by default, just like on Linux, the root user has all permissions to everything. I think you can actually rename the root user and revoke certain permissions if you wanted to, but we won't really get into that. So we want to go ahead and create a user, just like this. So you say create user at localhost identified by password. So that password, I believe, is encrypted or hashed by default, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it. This part right here at localhost only allows you to log in from the local computer. By default, MySQL only allows local logins, I believe. I hope. At one point it has. So we'll just say create user WordPress at localhost identified by password 1 exclamation point. And there we have our user. So by default, that user can't do anything. But what we want to do is give it basically all permissions on WordPress. And we could actually restrict the permissions that are needed. If we said select only, it would only allow the user to select on WordPress, but that basically wouldn't allow WordPress to update anything, and it would probably get annoyed. So you can probably say select, update, create, insert, and a few permissions that would be pretty much all you would need. But we won't really get into that right now. So I just say grant all privileges on WordPress.star to user at localhost. Or did I say privileges? Privileges to, on WordPress.star to WordPress at localhost. And I misspelled privileges. It's one of those words that I can't seem to spell right. And there we go. So let's just kind of test this out here. So by default, we did log in as root. I'm just going to look it up here because I forget how to change the user. So it is lowercase u. So we can see here we got a couple syntactical differences. So let's say u root, and I'll just specify my password right here. Okay, so that's how I would do it. I'd say -p, and then I'd say my password without any spaces, basically. So I'll say we're going to log in as our new user, which is WordPress, and we'll prompt for password. That will log us in. If we say show databases, we have less databases this time around since we have less permissions. So I just say use WordPress, and I could say create table A. ID int f. I have it mixed up. Okay. Type 1 field 1. No, it's right. Oh, I need my names the other way around. So this would just create a table A. It would have one value, and it would be of type integer. So you can see that succeeded. Show tables. We would have our one table. We could say desk A, which would basically be short for describe, and it would show us our fields, our types, weather, and some other information about that. So that's basically all you would need to know to install MySQL. The reason perhaps why I'm not so good with this syntax is every SQL engine seems to have its own way of doing things. And we'll look at that when we go into Postgres here really quick. So I just want to talk about that really quick. Hopefully, yeah, we have plenty of time left. So installing Postgres is pretty similar. So we'll apt get install PostgreSQL. Then we also have to do PostgreSQL client. And I had already installed that from when I was testing this. PG, which one is it? Actually, we need to switch. We need to switch over to the Postgres user, so this is a little bit different. Postgres, and then it's PSQL to open up the console. So you can do the same usernames, passwords, kind of remote type of thing, but Postgres also does Unix permissions. So if you're running a Unix user as the Postgres user, it will automatically assume you have permissions to log in to the database. So MySQL, the default user is root, which has all permissions. Postgres, the default user is Postgres, which has all of the default permissions. And we can see we're in now. So remember the show tables, the show databases, the desk, and all of those type of things. The way that things are done in Postgres are slightly different. Let's go over here and look at those. So the